Now here's a game very dear to my heart that I recently replayed to see if it holds up, and it totally does. So the Gothic series is the original Eurojank RPG, right? It is very different from the formulaic RPGs of today, which I think is due to the different approach to game design that people, and specifically Piranha Bytes, took back in the day. Let's start with the world, which has a degree of believability you don't usually feel with other RPGs. When Gothic 1 came out in 2001, it was a big selling point. I remember that it was what we now call open world, right? You could go anywhere that the game world would reasonably allow, because the premise was this. You're in a prison colony that's encased in a magical barrier that you could go into, but no one could get out of. And if you tried to get out in the game, your character would get zapped dead. But within those confines, you were not arbitrarily restricted by the game. And everything else that happens in the game world is largely congruent with the gameplay possibility space as well, and not in a formulaic way. By that I mean the game largely does not outwardly abstract narrative happenings into game mechanics, like say reputation meters, or quest trackers, or 0 to 5-star police pursuit levels. So to a high level of fidelity, interactions with characters play out like they would if the characters were real. For one thing, there's mechanics, like if you walk into someone's house, people will come at you like, get the hell out of here. And if they catch you stealing, they will attack. Or in the city in Gothic 2, you will have to pay a fine to the city watch. Then there's this mechanic of fighting characters, but not to the death. So if you beat up a non-bandit NPC, they will not drop dead right away, but rather lie on the ground squirming for a bit, and then they get up and go, "Alright, you win," or something to that effect. And this mechanic is frequently used narratively as well. That is to say, in quests or just interactions with characters. And if you do want to kill them, you can give a squirming NPC the coup de grace as well, but that'll be a major crime. And dead NPCs will be dead forever, so that can preclude you from completing certain quests. And the characters don't just stand there with exclamation marks over their heads either. They have their own things to do and have relationships with each other as well. The quests they give you don't fall into explicit categories like they do in a lot of modern games, like say in map clearing games, where you will have different symbols for different types of missions on the map, and they're all formulaic, so they can easily be replicated for more content, right? So in Gothic 1 and 2, it's pretty much all handcrafted. The quests are specific problems or propositions that specific characters have. A couple of times you will have a quest like, bring me 5 of this or that item, but those totally make sense too. Like, they don't take you out of the experience or remind you that you're playing a game, you know? You do have a journal screen with quests listed, but that's all it is. It's a diary where you get a new paragraph every other step of the way, right? It's more to remind you where you're at. And in keeping with the realness of the characters and their problems, the whole game world has a socio-political state that is in when you enter. So in Gothic 2, you're on an island that's an ore mining colony, and the king on the mainland is at war with the orcs and needs that ore to be shipped. And the mines are in a valley which is separate from the base world, and that valley is the base world of Gothic 1, where the magical barrier used to be. And the prisoners would mine the ore and it would be shipped off, but now thanks to you, the magical barrier has been destroyed in Gothic 1 and orcs have overrun the mining valley. So there's tension there. And there's also tension within the base world in Gothic 2, because the government has been putting the thumbscrews on the farmers, and a group of them has declared independence and hired mercenaries, which are former prisoners from the mining valley. So they're in open revolt. And then the player has his own agenda, i.e. the main quest, which is to combat a looming evil that the rest of the world does not yet know about. And that bit is a bit cliche in the game, but it's sort of couched in all the coherent realness of the game world that it kind of works. And Gothic 1 had a similarly tense situation inside the barrier as well. So then you come in and upset this narrative world state once again. So with all this coherence, your own actions feel very consequential, which is great. What I always thought was integral to the whole narrative reality of the game was the faction system. So in Gothic 1 and 2, you have 3 major factions each, and the player has to join one of them to get on with the main quest. In Gothic 2, that's the City Watch, so the government. Secondly, the mercenaries hired by the farmers. Thirdly, the monastery, where you can become a mage. And each one has different things you have to do to be let in. The monastery just needs you to bring 1,000 gold and a sheep, so you'll have to do some questing for that and buy a sheep from a farm and then lead it to the monastery gate. The mercenaries need you to get approval from a number of their members, and those have different things you have to do for them. And the City Watch requires you to apprentice for a craftsman in the city, because that will make you a citizen. And those craftsmen can actually teach you crafting as well, which is relatively basic, as in gather materials and assemble them at a crafting station. And this guy's using his own alchemy table literally all day, so you can only craft at night there, which is weird. Anyway, as you go through the world, you will become familiar with the factions and their place in the world, and it will be a big deal to finally become one of them. A not insignificant part of that is that you get a set of armor from that faction, which is a power spike for one thing, but also makes your character fit in with them, right? So that ties you into the game world pretty well. The factions don't change the main quest, but they do have some differences gameplay-wise, and some side quests. So anyway, once you've joined a faction, that's chapter 1 of the main story done, right? Now, the chapter structure is another big one, I think. The main quest is divided into chapters, and each one starts with a splash screen like Chapter X, chapter title, and each chapter the world state changes. New mobs spawn in the world, characters have new conversation options, meaning new quests. Some characters will be somewhere else on account of them being in some predicament you can help them with, and big world-changing main quest things have happened as well, right? And I think that's a brilliant and straightforward way of refreshing the game world with content and making it feel more alive. You don't just work through an area and check it off the list. You're part of the world, you know? The combat system seems sort of janky, but it is thought out. It has its own rhythm to it, not only in tapping at the right frequency for the highest volume of strikes, but also in how far enemies hop back when you swing at them, at what point you can hit them again, when to switch targets, and whatnot. There are cheese things and sort of overpowered spells, but I like that as well. So you can buy a Rain of Fire spell scroll to clear out a bandit camp if you position yourself well, and that way you could complete a quest you otherwise couldn't. Now, I don't think we will see another game like Gothic 1 and 2 anytime soon. Not from a big or even medium-sized publisher anyway. I think Gothic was made with an attitude towards creating games that just isn't applied anymore. Namely, deriving game design from the narrative reality that is being portrayed, as opposed to deriving game design from other games. I have a video about a tweet which mentions that dichotomy. So, I think for Gothic, they thought up a world they wanted to portray, and the player then needed to be enabled to interact with it in the ways that the world dictates. I remember hearing one of the head guys in some interview say, "We just thought it was going to be the best game ever, and we didn't have much else at that point." So they just took their wild aspiration and went from that, as opposed to going, "Let's make a game with the open world of Far Cry and the combat from Fable and the character progression from Baldur's Gate," or whatever. You see what I mean? Or you see that in other art forms as well, right? A common way to pitch anything is this meets that. And that approach isn't without merit either, because you can build on what others have already explored. But I think we should always be able to go back and remember what we're trying to achieve, which is to portray a narrative reality and give the audience access to that. That's what we should be aiming at. There will be concessions along the way, but one should always be aware of them. You shouldn't just use game design solutions because others are using them, but because they're tools for you to make the game world accessible. And I mean accessible as in make it possible for a human being to interact with a fictional world. I'm not specifically talking about, like, disabled people or anything. So the game world is what people want to interact with, not the rules of the game. The rules are just the interface that players use to access the game world, which is most apparent with the literal user interface, right? So you can make a game world and fill it with stuff, but you can't realistically have the player be able to interact with every bit of stuff in a manner that would be congruent with the reality that is being portrayed. Meaning, not every door can be opened, not every book can be read, not every toilet can be pissed in. Now, there are different solutions for that problem. You could have doors all barred, or locked, and then the character says to himself, it's locked, or it just makes a rattling sound when you try to use it or something. But then, will you do that with everything in the game? Or you could have the game point out everything you can interact with via some sort of graphic, like a floating icon. But then, as soon as you make it a rule in your game that everything that's interactable has a symbol floating over it, your game world will become separated from your actual game, which is now UI based, at least to some degree. And that has its own advantages too, in that it makes the rules of the game clear to the player, but you're trading immersion for that, right? The player now knows what he can interact with, but he also knows everything else is just window dressing. Now, granted, in modern games, the worlds are so full of stuff that looks interactable that it becomes really hard to not resort to UI overlays and outline highlight shaders and whatnot. Now in Gothic, you can generally interact with the objects in the game, at least in the same way that NPCs do. You can fry your meat in their pans, that's not a euphemism. You can sleep in their beds, and for many objects it's literally just for flavor, like there's no point standing around sawing a log or anything, but you can if you want. But it's not just the objects, it's that the whole world isn't portrayed as just a stage for fights and ticking off items on your quest tracker, right? Instead, the game makes you feel like you're one of the characters in the game world. In Gothic 1, you're one of the prisoners in the colony, and you have to pay the guards to leave you alone. If you refuse, they will beat you up and just take what you have. And that's another thing with the beatdown mechanic. Whether you start the fight or they do, if they win, they will rob you when you're down. And here's another cool thing on that note. In Gothic 2, there's a bit where you get attacked by bandits, and on them you find a picture of yourself. So the NPCs had a quest to kill the player, which is just neat. And the quests are usually also congruent with the logic of the game world. So if a quest tells you to do one thing, but narratively you could resolve the issue another way, then that's probably also possible. Like there's a merchant in the city who asks you to slip an illegal item into another merchant's pocket and then report her to the city watch so that he can take her spot on the marketplace. And you can do that, or you can just report him, but then that will preclude you from getting other quests later on from him, or something to that effect. And here's another kind of subversive interaction with NPCs. There's this guy at the mercenary camp, right? And when you try to pass him, he stops you and shakes you down. And if you're a wily gamer, you might just load a save and then go around him, but there's another asshole up the hill that stops you going, hey, I noticed the other guy didn't shake you down. Hold on, I'll call him over. So screw you, right? But if you've talked to another mercenary up the road before, he may have told you about the guy that shakes people down, and he tells you it's not so bad, because afterwards you will have the shakedown guys vote in case you want to join the faction. It's like the bad guys aren't just obstacles either, but at least somewhat fleshed out as characters, you know? And they don't talk in fantasy cliches, by the way. These games are actually the only games I played the German version of, because the developer was German and they wrote the dialogues in a vernacular that is much closer to how Germans actually talk. Whereas with localized media, you often have characters sounding translated. The cultural aspect of the production is also interesting, I think. These games have a certain Central European grit that's different from your run-of-the-mill fantasy you get in other properties. It's a realness, an attitude that characters have toward the harsh realities of their lives that they express in the way they talk. And the general look of the world exudes that as well. I think you also get this Central European grit in the Witcher series, which is from Poland, as you know. But Gothic has an even more grounded kind of fantasy with no elves or dwarves. Every humanoid that's not human is a monster, basically. There is a part in Gothic 1 where you fraternize with an outcast orc shaman, which is kind of goofy, though. I think there's plenty of merit to having orcs be unequivocally monstrous. It's basically the abstract concept of an enemy manifest. And, I mean, that's a hallmark of fantasy, is having abstract archetypes distilled in their purest form, right, as manifestations. So yeah, these games may turn you off initially on account of the janky feel and the lack of established gameplay conventions and quality of life stuff, but they give you a sense of immersion you rarely see in games anymore. And if you compare the remake that's been teased a while ago with a playable demo to the original Gothic, you'll see all the hallmarks of modern game design just dismantling what made the original great. You have icons all over, invisible walls. Diego now talks like some toff, and he's overly courteous. And the player character comments on everything with idiotic quips that just reek of modern-day writing.
Worst prison ever.
So for that remake, I have zero hope. I don't even want to know what they do about the female characters in Gothic 1, which were what you would expect them to be in a medieval prison colony ruled by the prisoners. And I am aware Piranha Bytes has been making more RPGs that are similar to Gothic 1 and 2, namely the Risen series that started strong, and the new Elex series, which also started decent. But I think they've never reached the heights of Gothic 1 and 2 since. Possibly because the staff has changed so much, you know. You know how it is. Anyway, Gothic 2 is still great. It has elements that the greater game developing public should have learned from but didn't, probably because it wasn't a big hit in North America. The game world or narrative reality based approach is the abstract takeaway, but also the thing with the factions. I know you have groups you can join in like Skyrim, but they're not exclusive and they're not tied into the plot or the world in the same way. And the thing with the chapters refreshing the world is just brilliant. There may be other games that took inspiration from Gothic that I don't know. I've seen Two Worlds and that looked almost like a knockoff. I think those games weren't very good overall though, were they? Personally, I hope to someday be in a position to make a big ol' RPG with a design philosophy akin to the one apparent in Gothic 1 and 2, so I'm working on that. In the meantime, you could play a very different game that I made, and here's an ad for that. Slasher's Keep is a first-person roguelike with a focus on melee combat and loot. It has randomly generated dungeons with orcs, mole rats, and other monsters to fight, lots of loot to find, and a drag-and-drop weapon crafting system. I made it all by my lonesome, and it's available for PC on Steam.